The populations of China and India are rising at a rapid speed. Within a decade, the two countries' populations together rose by 255 million people. That's almost 4 times the entire population of France in just 10 years. How did the population get so big? The populations in India and China have always been reasonably larger than the rest of the world. This was due to them being the ideal place to be. China had good soil, stable climate, and lots of water. They never really faced many life-threatening issues, such as when the Romans were off killing the people in the Mediterranean in 133 BCE, the Indians and Chinese only really had to focus on making food and making children. Also, in China, they had very advanced technologies for the time period, such as the Duzhenyan irrigation system, which is still up today, 2,000 years later. People also tended to settle in places with lots of rice, which China had a surplus of. In China and India, there were plenty of resources, access to food and water, and lots of trade. They could trade for things like tools and weapons. The population in China started increasing dramatically during the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s through 1800s because of newer medicines and treatments. In India, the population got very large in the early 1900s. This was right after the British stopped ruling them, and because the British were gone, they had the availability to get more medicines. The Indians always had about 6 kids prior to medicines because only about 2 would survive. But because they had access to medicines, 5 to 6 kids would survive, leading the population to grow rapidly. The population had never been 1 billion before 800, nor had the population growth rate exceeded 0.5%. And the current growth rate is 1.13%, and its peak in 1962 was over 2.1%. It took the world 7 million years to reach 1 billion, but only 200 to reach 7 billion. The world population between 1900 and 2000 was 3 times greater than the whole history of humanity, and 6.5% of all people ever born in the entire history of the human race are currently living. So if these 25 people represent the estimated 107 billion people ever to live, the ones alive would currently represent nearly 2. This dramatic population rise is possible because of modern medicines, lower infant mortality rates, higher birth rate, longer lives, decreased death rate, immigration and emigration, and cultural influences. India and China are equivalent to 37% of the world's population compared to the U.S., which is only 4% of our population. The population of India and China are rapidly rising, as you can see in these clips. Together, China and India's population are equal to 3.5 times all of Europe, 8 times all of the USA, and 117 times Australia's populations. In China, there are 381 people per square mile, and in India, there are 1,156 people per square mile. China has attempted to control the rising population by the one-child policy. The policy was introduced in 1978, and although it was slightly successful, there were far too many cons, such as people abandoning their female children and only wanting their male children because they carry on the last name, potentially make more money, and are supposedly stronger. The one-child policy was formally ended in 2015. On to the human population weather forecast. India is expected to beat China in terms of population in 2020, and after that date, both countries' fertility rates will lower and the urban population will rise. The worldly population is predicted to reach the whopping 10 billion by 2050. Back to you. This amount of humans arises many questions about whether or not the world could actually support this many people. Climate change will increase the more population increases because of pollution and the greenhouse effect. The climate change will kill lots of animals, as well as demand for animal products. Experts predict that in 300 to 2,000 years from now, 75% of our animals will be extinct. The climate change is partially because of pollution, which not only kills animals but humans too. As population increases, so does trash. Landfills are more than full, they're overflowing. This causes sickness and disease, and this will not stop until people discover how to recycle trash in a sanitary and energy-efficient way. This brings us to our next issue, viruses and diseases. As the population gets larger, people tend to settle in the same places, which leads to very crowded cities. When people are densely packed, viruses and diseases spread, and considering there are 1,200 people per square mile in India, illnesses spread very quickly, and this might lead to the next Black Death, and may ultimately lead to the world's mass destruction. Nothing much. The availability of food will drop because of the decreasing of animals and lost cropland due to industrialization, and food prices will rise, which may lead to more starvation because if prices rise, the poor people won't be able to pay for it, and food isn't necessarily something you can't just live without. Speaking of the poor, the rich will use up all the resources, leaving nothing for the poor. The water supply is definitely the opposite of never ending. Only 0.37% of the world's water is drinkable, and already 2.7 billion people don't have access to it. So, what will happen when there are 4 billion more people? If we don't learn to use our water carefully, as in not wasting it on luxuries like water parks, the consequences may be unforgiving. Of course, to many, the main solution is simply to get rid of the people by sending them off to a different planet. This is 100% not the solution, because it uses so much money and resources just to send them there, let alone keep them there. All of these problems come down to the giant population that is ahead of us, and the solution still seems to be a mystery.